You really want to go fly fishing, but with all the rain and the spring snow melt, the rivers are blown out and muddy. So what's a fly guy to do? Well, I got some ideas for you on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Once again, brought to us, as always, by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 136 stores nationwide. That company and I have been together since the very beginning of my career, and we would personally appreciate it if you would check them out next time you're looking for outdoor gear. Guys, it's the middle of June. It's not supposed to be this cold and wet. I live in Colorado. I'm not sure where in the country you might be listening from, but if you're in the Western United States, it's very cold and very wet. And I just drove up several of the local rivers here. I live right on the Front Range of Colorado. Got a bunch of rivers close to me, or several of them. Everything is muddy and blown out, and really running hard. And some of it's from snowmelt, some of it's from the daily toad chokers we've been getting. And I do mean daily. It rained, even last night, almost the entire night. And we're getting a lot of water, and it's a blessing. We need it. The Western United States needs the water, so make no mistake, I am not complaining about it. I'm just observing what we're seeing. And I've lived in Colorado long enough to know that water is king around here, and we need it. Everybody around needs it. Everybody downstream from us needs it. So bring on the rain. However, if I'm a fly fishing guy, this could be a frustrating spring and early summer. A lot of muddy water, a lot of high water. I'm not an expert on bug hatches, but I'd be willing to bet you the hatches timing's out of whack a little bit. Just in general, the seasons have been really strange. It's June, what is it? Today's June 16th, and the high today is supposed to be like 52 degrees. So that's really hard to even believe this time of year, when this time last year was 100 and change. So again, happy to have it, but changing things up. So here's my answer to the guy that's got a whole bunch of fly tackle and a strong urge to go fly fishing, and your rivers are shot. And that is warm water fly fishing. And the reason I want to throw this one out there is I think there's so many people missing the boat on fly fishing for other species besides trout. And I'm going to be real candid when I tell you I've been fly fishing since I was about 12 years old, give or take. My grandpa gave me a fly rod, an old fly rod. I believe the first one I got was actually fiberglass with steel ferrules, and then I moved up from one to a graphite rod from there, worked my way along. But I did learn to fly fish very shortly after I moved to Colorado from Florida. And the reason I did was because that's what I thought you had to do. Even though my first love was either bass fishing or saltwater fishing. And I went down that road, fly fished like crazy all the way through my teenage years, but never quit bass fishing and things as well. But it wasn't until much later in life that I started applying my fly fishing to my love of bass fishing and other species of warm water fish. And when I did that, I realized that, geez, I like that kind of fly fishing even more than running water. And the reason is this. I have a very clear reason why I'd rather fly fish on still water than running water. The fun part for me about fly fishing is fly casting. I love the feel of a bunch of line in the air. And the farther I can throw that line and still be effective, the happier I am, or the more accuracy that I need to have to be effective, the happier I am. And a running water scenario, unfortunately, for most scenarios, if you're going to be really, really consistent as a trout fishing guy here in the Western United States with a fly rod, you have to be a good nympher. And for me, nymphing is, and this is for me, you do you. If you want to be a nympher guy, Euro nympher, bobber fisherman, whatever, you knock yourself out. Again, I've always said in every podcast, you fish how you want to fish. How I like to fish is the casting. And when I've got a bobber and a 3 nymph stack and a split shot of some sort on there, and this big old hard to handle rig, all the beauty of fly fishing gets lost for me. For me, I want a fly, a leader, a tapered fly line, and a fly rod. And I want to turn that loop over pretty. I want to keep a nice tight loop. I want to throw it accurately. I want to do it with control. I don't want to have to watch my back cast. I want to be able to feel all of that. And I surely don't want to be flopping nymphs down on the surface on that kind of half-hearted roll cast. And again, I'll be the first to tell you it's exceptionally effective. Just not how I like to fish. And there's 3 stages in fishing. First, you want to catch fish. Then you want to catch big fish. Then you want to catch fish how you want to catch fish. And that's where I'm at. I want to catch fish how I want to catch fish. And if that means I have to go nymphing, then I'm going to get my spinning rod out and we're going to go catch fish for real. And so that's just where my personal opinion lies. Again, you do you. In stillwater situations, it doesn't matter if I'm flats fishing in Florida or bass fishing in Texas or walleye fishing in my backyard or whatever the case might be. When you're fishing stillwater scenarios, you always have better chance at traditional casting, and that's what I really enjoy. So that's the thing for me that makes me want to do it. And then the more I do it, when the conditions are right for fly fishing in stillwater, the more I do it, the more I enjoy it, and the more I realize that it can be very, very effective for catching fish. And in some scenarios, fish are easy to catch on fly tackle than they are spinning tackle, even in a stillwater, warm water fishing environment. So specifically, I'm going to focus on the warm water side of it, because you could stillwater fish for trout as well, but I'm going to focus on the warm water side of it because, 1, that's what I guide for. And for 2, that's again where my first love is warm water fishing more than trout. I love trout fishing, and I'll be the first to tell you trout fight really well. I do a ton of trout fishing every year, But if somebody said, okay, you got a week to go fishing tomorrow, I'm going warm water fishing somewhere. And that's just where my first love is. So fly fishing in warm water then therefore makes sense. Now, before I get too deep into this, you could be anything in warm water. It could be bluegills or yellow perch or crappies. It could go all the way up to pike. It could go largemouth, smallmouth bass. It could go white bass or stripers or wipers. I mean, anything that can be caught in fresh water with a spinning rod can be caught with a fly rod. The one thing that makes me want to focus on certain seasons, let's just say, is because I don't want my fish to be too deep. If the fish are too deep, the fly rod is not the right tool, at which point I'm again going back to conventional tackle. For me, whatever fishing rod, as long as there's an artificial of some sort on the end of it, whatever fishing rod that is the right tool for the job is the one that I'm going to pick up and throw every single time. Because really, if push comes to shove, I like to catch fish, and I like to catch them every time. So whatever the right tool is. If the wind's blowing a bajillion miles an hour, I'm not going to get the fly rod out. If the fish are 20 feet deep, I'm not going to get the fly rod out. Now, some hardcore fly fisherman's going to say, well, I can get 20 feet deep with a sinking line. At which point, I'm going to say, yep, I agree with you 100%. Go back to what I said about 4 minutes ago about I like the casting. A full sink line, in my opinion, is not as much fun to cast. You have to strip it all the way back to get it out of the water. It slows everything down. Just again, it comes back to the tactile sensation of fly casting. And there's clubs, several clubs around the country that do nothing but fly cast. They don't even fly fish. They judge each other on their fly casting. They have distance casting contests and all of that. And I'm not a huge distance caster, although I love throwing. I can take my 5-weight and I can throw the entire 90-foot fly line. And so, yes, I practice. Yes, I can do it. Yes, I can throw a 90-foot cast with a 5-weight rod with a standard fly line, not a specialized shooting line that they used in casting competitions. Conversely, I won the combination fly and spin casting contest at the International Sportsman's Expo this year, alongside my partner, Jeff Wagner, by hitting the fly casting accuracy contest for the win. So accurate casting, I don't care if it's a spinning rod, bait casting rod, or fly rod, accurate casting catches you more fish than anything else. And so I really like to focus on being very accurate with a fly rod. And a great way to practice that is on still water, because in the river, everything happens on the river's time. The river sweeps your line down. You typically have stuff in behind you that's in the way in a lot of scenarios, unless you're standing out in the river. And the extra distance between you and your fly means you're in less control with all your drifts and all of these things. In still water, as long as I get that fly line to lay out straight, I'm in total control. I don't care if it's 20 feet in front of me or 90 feet in front of me. I'm in control of it pretty well, as long as it's in a relatively straight line. So if there's a bunch of wind and then I'm going to have surface current, all right, then I don't want the fly rod. Also, fly casting in the wind is not as much fun. Also, catching fish in wind on the fly rod is harder because the flies don't have as many triggering qualities as I can have with a lure. With a lure, I might have big time amount of vibration or rattles or flash or a huge wide wobble or the ability to dive and then pop back to the surface. All these different things I can do with a lure that I can't do with a fly. So I need the conditions to be relatively quiet, so to speak, for fly fishing. Not too much wind, not too much crazy activity. When I get those kind of days, I'll be one of the first guys to grab a fly rod. Now, I mentioned they need to be shallow enough. Basically, depending on the species, they're shallow enough all the time. Some are not. So for instance, walleye fishing. We like to guide for walleyes with fly tackle, and it can be surprisingly effective as long as my walleyes are maybe 10 or 12 feet deep or shallower, which is a lot of the time. Conversely, summertime, when they're on deep humps and they're 30 feet below the boat, I'm not even going to think about the fly rod, right? So it's a seasonal thing about fish being shallow. If my fish are 10 feet or less deep, my fly rod's in play all the time, guaranteed. And if they're deeper than that, then it's debatable a little bit as to whether or not I can draw them to the surface, and we'll go into that in a minute. Or do I need to switch away, from there? So that's kind of how my decision point is on it. Now, also I want to throw out, if you're a fly fisherman listening to this, you already have the fly tackle I'm going to advocate that you need. If you're not a fly fisherman and you're considering getting into it and you're a conventional tackle guy, understand that you don't need anything specialized. The same fly tackle you buy for, say, smallmouth bass fishing will work just fine for you taking in the river and fly fishing there if you want to be diverse in the long run. And I fully understand that. I might carry the same 6-weight throwing streamers in the river that I do for throwing streamers for smallmouth bass up on shallow flat banks in my backyard. Conversely, I might have more like a 3-weight that I will throw for green sunfish, crappies, bluegills, or small bass, because let's face it, at the end of the day, we like to catch fish. And if I've got an area, my lake's known for having tons and tons and tons of smallmouth bass between 8 and 12 inches long. Well, a 3-weight's an absolute blast with those fish. Take a small fly, you'll catch them one after the other. And I want to throw out this. It's an excellent way to get some reps on bite detection and hook setting because you're going to catch a ton of fish. And the 3-weight is a fun way to do it. So a 3-weight, a 5-weight, a 6-weight, up from there could be still very usable. You might end up in a 7 or 8-weight in the largemouth bass realm, depending on the size of the flies you want to throw. And as always, we dictate our fly rod based on the size of the flies we're throwing, not the size of the fish we're catching. So the only exception to that might be something like tarpon or like really big, really, really strong fish that can still be caught on pretty small flies. But most of the time, if you're talking, say, pike fishing and down in terms of size of the fish, the fly is going to dictate the size of the fly rod, not the fish itself. So I might very easily be throwing a 7 or 8 weight when I'm largemouth bass fishing, or an 8 or 9 weight, maybe even a 10 weight for pike fishing because I'm throwing a huge fly. And I want to point out that last year, the longest fish anyway, if you go by pure length, the longest fish I caught all of last year was a 50-inch northern pike that I caught on a 10-weight fly rod. But I want to point out that 10-weight fly rod was because I was throwing a fly that was upwards of 12 inches long, which is an enormous bug to throw with a fly rod. And therefore, you better have a big fly rod. And just for the record, real quick, in that scenario, I've got a straight 20-pound untapered leader, just straight 20-pound fluorocarbon leader right out to the bug. And then right at the very tip, there's a short piece of wire about 8 inches long, just enough, a tieable steel, just enough to keep the teeth off of that 20-pound fluorocarbon. There's no fancy tapered leader. The leader's stiff enough. The leader's short in that scenario, and so it works out very, very good. But back to what I was saying, if you're a trout guy, you have the fly rod you need, I promise. If you're not a trout guy, go buy yourself a 5 or a 6 weight, get a 9-footer, get a floating weight forward fly line, and you're going to be in the hunt for any kind of trout fishing you want to do anyway. So let's step back a little bit and talk about some specifics about the flies. And because as a longtime fishing instructor, I always preach you choose your lure first, then you choose your line, then you choose your rod, then you choose your reel. That's how it goes, but it doesn't start the other way around. Fly is going to be the same way. So if I'm going to target bluegills, crappies, green sunfish, pumpkin seeds, things like that, then the chances are very high that I'm going to throw very small flies, and they're going to be lightly weighted. So maybe a 3-weight, 4-weight, maybe a 5-weight, although that's going to bully a bunch of the fish when you catch them. Conversely, if I go up from there and I'm going to throw for smallmouth, maybe white bass, maybe some walleyes, maybe some light duty largemouth, then I'm going to be up in the 5, 6, or 7 weight range. And then if I want to go for more largemouth, pike, maybe wipers or stripers, then I'm going to go up from there. It might be a 7, 8, maybe even a 9, as I said, from there. For me, I don't even own a 10 weight for freshwater applications. A 9's as far as I go. I had to borrow the 10 weight to catch the pike up in Alaska because I was throwing flies so much bigger than anything I even owned that I couldn't justify going and buying a whole new fly rod setup for it. So I borrowed one from a buddy. Thank you, Tim Farnsworth. But anyway, so that's what you're looking at. You don't need, there's a bunch of misnomers. You don't need a really expensive fly rod. For a couple of $100, you can get a really good quality fly rod that will serve you just fine and will cast better than you can as a noob fly angler. I promise you that. And I'm all for buying tackle you're going to grow into, but you don't know what your casting stroke is going to be like. You don't know what you're going to desire in a fly rod. So you don't even know what you should spend your extra money on, even if you have it. So even if it's in the budget to buy a $500 or $600 fly rod, until you fly fished enough to have some idea what you like in terms of a fly rod, could be a fast action, a medium action, a slower action. Maybe you end up liking 8.5 footers rather than 9.5 footers or whatever the case might be. Figure those things out before you spend a bunch of money. So for me, I'm going to go like a mid-level grays, something like that. And then I'm going to learn to fish with that. If I've already got the rods, I'm not going to go buy something specialized just for to go warm water fishing. Go warm water fishing, see if you like it, see what's wrong with the tackle you have, if anything, and then worry about buying from there. But you'll get a better educated decision once you have a little bit of experience, I guess is what I'm getting at. And that'll help you a whole bunch as far as that goes. So for me, as a general rule, if I'm buying fly rods for still water, I'm going to buy them in a little bit faster action because I tend to throw longer casts. If I'm going to buy a fly rod specifically for river fishing, it's going to be a little bit slower and a little softer, and that's because I'm going to be throwing typically a much shorter cast on average, and I'm not typically as rewarded with line speed in the air as much, I'm also going to do a bunch more roll casting, and so none of those things put as much load on the fly rod, and therefore I want a little bit slower or less powerful fly rod for that. So for the line, pretty much always going to be a weight forward line for me these days. I don't really deviate from that a whole bunch on anything. There's some argument for double tapers here and there. Basically what that means, and I'm not going to get too much into the lingo of the line, but the line, a double tapered line is symmetrical. One end of the fly line, the other end of the fly line are the same, and they can be reversed on your reel with no change in action of how they cast. Conversely, a weight forward line will carry, depending on what weight forward you get, will carry a higher percentage of its weight, of the weight of the fly line, closer to the front. And that's kind of like a dart. If you ever throw darts, the weight is concentrated on the front of the dart. It gives you distance and stability. Same thing with a lot of other things along those lines. So that extra weight at the front will allow that line to shoot better, will load better on a short cast, or load easier on a short cast, I should say, and then will shoot better and maintain more line speed. So I tend to go weight forward with basically everything. Yes, you lose a little bit of durability in the long run because the line cannot be reversed, but in my mind, the performance is better for that as well. And again, they're floating, and I'm going to go back to the floating thing here. Or I'm going to focus on the floating thing here for just a minute, because the floating part of the fly line, the reason that that's important as opposed to a sinking line or a sink tip line, the fly line sits on the surface of the water. And therefore, if I want to throw a floating bug of some sort, my fly line will not pull it down. So for one, I get versatility right there. Two, if I want to be slightly under the surface, I can use just a fluorocarbon leader and my floating fly line, and that fluorocarbon leader, depending on the length of it and the pound test of that fluorocarbon, will pull my fly down as well and give me the depth that I need. And then if I need deeper than that, I can now go with a point weighted fly. In other words, a fly with a bead on it or some weight on the shank of the hook, something like that. And if I need still deeper, I can put a split shot. I can lengthen my leader out, put a split shot on it ahead of the fly, and use a point weighted fly. And at that point, I can throw as long of a leader as I can actively cast. I can fish as deep, I should say, as long of a leader as I can accurately cast. So if I can throw say a 9-foot leader with a little bit of weight on the end of it, using a weight forward fly line and a nice crisp fly rod, and I can turn that big leader over even with the weight on it, then I can easily fish in the 8 to 10 foot range with a floating fly line, because the leader will settle while the fly line floats, and that fly line will then give me a strike indicator as well. It will give me something to watch. My Costa sunglasses will be riveted on that. And the reason I throw out my brand of Costas, because polarized sunglasses will help you so much in line watching. People think it's about seeing the fish. No, for me, it's about seeing the line on the surface. And that weighted, either the fluorocarbon leader or the weighted flies, will pull the tip of the fly line under some. The farthest I can see out there towards the tip of my line, the better chance I have of detecting bites and the more fish I'm going to catch. So yes, I spend money on sunglasses. Yes, I wear them religiously. And in my opinion, if you fly fish ever without eye protection, you are crazy. Because I don't care how good a caster you are, eventually you will hit yourself in the head with a fly line. Even if it's overcast and yucky out, I will have either clear or amber lenses on all the time when I'm fly fishing, and I require it in my boat as a matter of contract as a fishing guide. So we do not fish without eye protection, especially with fly gear. So floating fly line will also give me a key thing, and that is a jigging motion. So let's say I've got a subsurface fly of any kind. It could be a little tiny wet fly, a little old school partridge soft tackle fly for bluegills. Catch tons of bluegills with it. Could be fantastic. Could be that little thing right there. Or a little tiny little minnow fly of some sort. Maybe a 1-inch long Clouser minnow for crappies. Perfect little Clouser minnow for crappies. It doesn't matter if I'm throwing that or the bigger bass bug. When I throw that thing out and I let it settle, it's going to pull the line down, 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 down. But the fly line itself is floating, and I'm going to keep my rod tip very close to the surface of the water, like within an inch or 2 or 3 at the most, so that my line's laid real flat. I don't have any of that bow in my line. I want my rod tip to be very close to the tip of my fly line all the time, or my rod tip to be very close to the water at the fly line all the time. What that's going to do when I strip on that bug, and I strip on it with my stripping hand, that bug's going to head for the surface, because as the fly line comes to me and it's got an angle down to the bug's going to come up in the water column. And then when I let go with my stripping hand and go to go back forward, now that thing's going to sink again, and it's going to give you that vertical jigging motion, no different than a guy that's working a jig with a spinning rod. That's important, because in in stillwater, warm water fishing, a high percentage of your bites, and I mean a very high percentage of your bites, a very, very high percentage of your bites are going to come as that fly settles back down in the water column. So if it doesn't rise up in the water column, it's not going to settle back down. So if I had a sink tip line or a full sinking line, besides not being as much fun to cast, my fly is going to move more horizontally. And there's been a ton of research done. You can ask Dr. Keith Jones from the Berkeley Fish Labs. You want to get a lot of bites, let your bait slowly sink. And nothing sinks as slow and beautiful as a fly with no extra weight on it. on a fluorocarbon leader, or a very small amount of weight on a fly on a fluorocarbon leader, it's going to sink so slow and tantalizing, and particularly with smallmouth and crappies and bluegills, that fall rate is critical. And the floating fly line gives me a chance to strip, let the bug come up, and then let it settle back down. Same thing with walleyes. 99% of the walleye fishing I do is done with a Clouser minnow. 99% of the fly fishing for walleyes is done with a Clouser minnow. That Clouser minnow is custom tied for me. They're made out of pure synthetic materials, no actual bucktail in it, which is traditional in a Clouser minnow. It would be tied with bucktail. I don't like bucktail because bucktail is very, very buoyant, particularly where, depending on the buck's tail, you take that hair from. It's very buoyant, which means I need more weight to get that fly to sink, which means it's less fun to cast. So if you have it made with synthetic materials that don't absorb, or that don't float, I should say, and even especially if they absorb water, now it's easy to cast, and it's more fun in general. So that's just using your materials to your advantage in that regard. The overwhelming majority of my walleye fly fishing is done with Clouser minnows. They're always either black or brown, occasionally a pearl colored, depending on the watercolor. And it's done with a floating fly line, and it's done with a very heavy fluorocarbon leader, and it's done so that when I strip it hard, the fly darts straight up, and then the whole thing settles right back down. And that makes a huge difference in catching walleyes as opposed to swimming horizontally. And anyone that's ever done any serious walleye jigging knows that walleyes love something falling through the water column. Sometimes they'll bite something that is horizontal. Almost always they'll bite something that's falling. So that's why jigging spoons and jigging wraps and blade baits and all of those things are so good for walleyes. It's why something like a soft stickworm is so good for bass fishing, because it settles straight down through the water column. Great way to pick up fish. So that's my basic system. I do like a good drag for stillwater fishing more than I would for rivers, because it's not that often that I get to hook and fish in a river that's going to pull me into my drag. It's typically they're going to be stripped in most of the time. There's sometimes obviously around really big fish, whatever, but most of the time they're going to be stripped in. Your reel isn't doing anything other than holding line, and needs to be durable so I can set it down the river and all that. On the deck of my boat, which is where I do the bulk of my fly fishing in still water, it's very possible that I could hook a 5-pound bass that's going to get me on the drag. It's very possible I can hook a big walleye or a wiper or striper that's going to for sure get me into the drag. So I do want a decent drag on a reel. My reels are pretty much all grays at this point. Fantastic reels, work great, not overly expensive, really good drag, nice and light, fantastic. There's other companies, you pick whichever one you like, but at the end of the day, a drag is a good thing to have. So that's really the only equipment it comes down to: a floating fly line, a fly rod size appropriate for the flies that are appropriate for the species you're going to target, and then go from there. And it's very simple. In terms of flies, let's look at flies real quick here. The aforementioned Clouser minnow is as good as anything you're going to throw in standing water, in my opinion, of subsurface flies. Fantastic. Can tie them from all the way down to like an inch or 3/4 of an inch even, all the way up to as big as you want to make one. And that's a good all-around fly. Basically, in my mind, it's the finesse jig of the fly fishing world. And I've had long talks with Bob Clouser about that. And in fact, I have a couple of his Clouser minnows tied on display right here in my office that he tied for me personally. And it's as versatile a fly gets. So that's one I'm going to have for sure. I'm going to have some sort of a partridge, old school partridge soft tackle fly, just a generic buggy looking little soft tackle fly that I can strip. I can either weight it and have it go down. I can have it unweighted to where it's right under the surface film, which is super effective for panfish. Or whatever. So that's a fly that I'm going to have for sure. I'm also for sure going to have some surface poppers, and this is where the grins come in. A fly rod and a popper on it, a little surface popper of some sort, depending on, again, what species I'm targeting. When I say a little surface popper, a little one for pike might be 1 inch in diameter or 1.5 inches in diameter. A little one for bluegills might be 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch in diameter. So some sort of a little popper is going to for sure be in my arsenal for almost anything, with the exception of maybe walleyes. Little popper on the surface can be fantastic. A couple nuances on the poppers. If I'm targeting bluegills, green sunfish, yellow perch, pumpkin seeds, there's not going to be rubber legs on there. What I find is that fish come up and pop the bug and the rubber legs catch on their lip and push the fly away. Your hook percentage goes down a ton. No rubber legs if I'm targeting panfish. If I'm targeting bass or up, anything like that, then all of a sudden the rubber legs are in play because they're excellent at drawing strikes. They'll draw strikes from panfish too, you just won't hook as many. So I like to really be concentrated on that as a nuanced thing. And really most of the time for me, the rubber legs will stay on there for bass and pike and things like that. That's a fly that I'm going to have for sure. And then the other fly I'll have besides a popper is some sort of a little diver. Typically, both my poppers and my divers, I'm not a big fan of deer hair and things like that. Call me old or new school. I'm not a traditionalist in that. A foam-bodied popper will float all day long, and I don't have to worry about the fly getting torn up. I don't have to worry about the fly sinking. Same thing with some sort of a little diver fly. I love a little deceiver or diver of some sort, something that'll go like a Dahlberg diver, something that'll just dive right under the surface when I strip it hard and then pop itself back to the surface because it floats. That can be excellent. In that scenario, you're looking at something like the #1 selling lure of all time, which was the old school Rapala floating minnow. These days I throw a hit stick. It's a much improved version of that. Same kind of thing. It floats at rest, and then when you pull it down, it dives, and then you slack it out, it floats. So some sort of a little diver fly that does that can be excellent as well. Typically it'll get bit either right when you pop it under or right when it breaks the surface film on the way up. And just for the record, that's an excellent way to catch trout as well, and you just don't see that many guys doing it. So that's kind of my spiel on the fly fishing thing. The big couple key things that I should throw out there real quick if you're not tuned into fishing for warm water fish at all. It's not typically going to be about the fly, it's going to be about how you move it. So if you notice, I only mentioned 4 genres of flies, right? And that's because with those 4 genres, I can do whatever I need. I can jig with it, I can keep it on the surface, I can keep it just under the surface, or I can hybrid thereof with the little diver fly. So it gives me a chance to do all of which I need. So for me, it's not about changing flies 25 times, particularly among the same genre. I have light, medium, and dark for colors, and that's it. Otherwise, I'll just focus on my size and focus on my retrieve details to get me fish caught. When it comes to the panfish, typically less is more. The less I move the fly, the more I just let it settle on its own, the more fish I will catch. Also, the smaller the fly, the more fish I will catch the vast majority of the time for panfish. For bass, it might be the other way around. It might be that the fly needs to go as fast as possible, at which point I'll use a combination of my stripping hand and my rod hand so I can use my rod to keep the fly moving. There's a lot of scenarios where if the fly stops, the fish will refuse it for bass fishing, and that's not what you want. You want the fly to run from the fish a lot of the time. In that case, again, it's down to the retrieve that's going to make more of a difference than anything else. You're trying to trigger fish with the retrieve, which is about the polar opposite of dead drifting a nymph or a dry fly in a river, where we're going to try not let that thing move at all and make it look as natural as possible drifting. Well, now the water's not moving. Now it's up to me to make the bug draw the strike. And that's fun. That's, as an angler, that's what tickles my fancy, and that I really enjoy. Focus on your weeds, focus on your weed lines, focus on throwing around cover. If this is all day one stuff, if you're not normally a warm water fisherman, you want to throw to the stick ups, you want to throw the edges of the weed lines, you want to throw to, close to the bank, even if the fish are out off the bank a little bit. You want your lure or your fly to be the proverbial, between a rock and a hard place, right up against the bank, something like that. Or back against the wall, I guess is a better analogy there. But you just definitely want to focus on throwing around targets and all that, and that's why I say the accuracy is a big deal. The other thing is staying away from your fish a little bit will typically catch you more fish, so you can be rewarded if you catch X number of fish on 20-foot casts. You might catch X plus 5 on 25 or 30-foot casts because they're not detecting you, particularly if you're in a boat or a float tube, kayak, paddleboard, or whatever. And so keep that in mind as well. Low light periods are good. Shade's always great. If you can find some little shade lines, little shady pockets, maybe overhanging willow bushes or something, creating some shade, throw a little surface popper in there and get her done for bass or whatever. very, very simple, classic, old school pattern. So, and I'm going to finish with this as far as it goes. Go at it with an open mind. Pay attention to what the fish are doing and go at it with an open mind. And I think you'll find that the warm water fishing is really good. Also, the fish are durable. There tends to be a lot of them. And if you're observant, walking around any sort of a pond or any of the lakes around, you'll see all sorts of food sources. I do not match the hatch when it comes to warm water fishing. I'm sort of minnow-like, sort of buggy-like, or sort of just commercial, or excuse me, commotion, I should say, on the surface. And I'll end this with an old John Gierach quote. And I met John Gierach and spent some time with him many years ago when I was in college in a writing class. Great guy. We were talking about bass fishing, and somebody had asked him, as he actually ended up writing it up in one of his books, had asked him about what did they think this fly mimicked, and it was just a giant, huge generic bug, and he said something to the effect of reminded them of prehistoric drowning pterodactyls, so that's the kind of thing that it's all about. It's not a match the hatch deal. It's really about making good presentations and having fun with it. So sorry guys, this one went long. I could talk for a long time on fly fishing for warm water stuff. I do it all the time, and I could just close it with this. There's a 3-weight in my garage, hangs there all the time, always rigged, always with a soft tackle on it. That soft tackle fly I tied when I was in about 10th grade, and I'm in my 50s, so that should tell you something about how my fly selection looks. Anytime there's any sort of commotion behind my house, I'm going to go down there and I throw that 3-weight. And yes, occasionally something will happen. I'll get broke off by something too big for the 3-weight, but it's worth it. It's enjoyable, and that's why we all fish. So, guys, I appreciate you listening. Hopefully you listen and you'll subscribe from wherever that's at. It doesn't matter if it's our YouTube channel or wherever, Spotify or wherever it is you listen to us. I'd appreciate it very much if you'd subscribe. This is a labor of love, no doubt about it. YouTube at Fishful Thinker. If you're not listening there, there's 605, I think, videos up there now, a couple of million views. We'd love to have you check that out. It's all education based. Please subscribe while you're there, or you can join the conversation on Facebook or Instagram. And we're kind of playing around with TikTok a little bit as well. All those are at Fishful Thinker. So also you can catch us on television on World Fishing Network, Altitude Sports, 5 days a week. So thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.